In the name of God, who creates, redeems, and sanctifies. Amen. Last month, 5 of us from Trinity joined a pilgrimage in El Salvador to honor the late Archbishop Oscar Romero, who lost his life because he spoke up for the powerless. Because of his sacrifice and his great compassion in life, he's beloved by most people in El Salvador. I spoke about Romero's life and the history of the Salvadoran Civil War on Palm Sunday 2 weeks ago. But today I want to tell you more about how people in El Salvador today are following the call of both the risen Christ and Romero to live in the power of the resurrection. On the second full day of our pilgrimage, our group loaded onto a bus at our hotel in San Salvador, the country's capital and largest city, and drove about an hour to an outlying community called Jardines de Colón. Jardines was first settled in the early 1980s by people fleeing the violence of the Civil War, a civil war being waged by the extreme right-wing military government against its own people. Jardines was founded as a Christian-based community inspired by the principles of liberation theology that called for the church to be in solidarity with the poor. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read about the early church. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. In this spirit, in the Jardines-based community, everything from the family-owned houses to the community center to the church and school to the library, everything was built by the community for the community. Generally without any government resources. And they've been remarkably self-reliant throughout their history. When we arrived, we were warmly welcomed by the community's youth, who began handing out icons and framed photos of Monsignor Romero that we could hold up in the festive procession that they were organizing. Most of us pilgrims were then put in the front of the line, and then we were off, joined by troops of dancers and costumed villains and heroes, as we all celebrated the legacy of a great man. Later in the day, we went on home visits to meet with some of the founding families of the community. While in these visits, we heard about many hardships during the war and later when gangs terrorized the whole country. Throughout the testimonies, we also heard hope. And it was in this hope that you could locate the truth that Romero spoke about his own impending death. He said, "I must say that as a Christian, I do not believe in death without resurrection. If they kill me, I will rise again in the Salvador." Hope for new life sustained the people of Jardines through the hardest times in their history, and hope sustains them even now. A week later, the disciples of Jesus were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Last week, as we celebrated Easter Day, the story began in the morning with an empty tomb. Followers of Jesus had come to anoint his body with spices, an act of love, and also a practical one, as the Jewish people of the first century did not practice embalming. But when the women arrived, there was no body. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene remains outside the tomb crying when Jesus appears to her. At first, she does not know who he is. After all, she was not expecting him to be alive. She thought that the body had been stolen. After he calls her by name and she recognizes him, she goes to tell the other apostles what has happened. Our story today picks up on the evening of the same day, the first day of the week. Mary has shared her experience with the 12 disciples, but from the other gospel accounts, it seems that they did not believe her, although they were alarmed by the missing body. And so on the evening of the first day of the week, Jesus' disciples, seemingly with no doubts that he is dead, but wondering what has happened to his body, are locked in a house, afraid of their own government and their own religious leaders, and Jesus appears among them. And perhaps because they were terrified, he speaks peace to them. And then he shows them his wounds. And the disciples rejoiced, because the wounds were signs that this was really the Jesus that they knew and loved. A week later, the disciples are still coming to terms with the strange and wonderful event that has taken place, but one of them had not been present. So now Thomas needs to see for himself, or he will not believe. And so Jesus appears and shows him his wounds. Thomas exclaims, "My Lord and my God." The disciple who is known, rather unfortunately, I think, as the doubter, doubting Thomas, actually makes the boldest and most direct affirmation of Christ's divinity of anyone in the Gospels. It is a moving scene, and it makes me think about all the places of woundedness in our lives that become new sites, that become sites of new life. Another such scene took place in a federal courthouse in West Palm Beach in 2002 when Dr. Juan Ramagosa testified against two Salvadoran generals accused of human rights violations. It was a civil suit, and the plaintiffs and defendants all resided in the United States at the time. All had fled their homeland at various points. The plaintiffs early on, while the defendants when the military government's reign of terror escalated even beyond their control as members of the ruling regime. It was estimated at the time that at least 1,000 war criminals from all over the world lived in safety in the United States. And so this lawsuit was an attempt to bring some measure of accountability to that. Juan Ramagosa was a trained surgeon in El Salvador. He had secretly treated victims of the military government's reign of terror, and for this he was kidnapped and tortured. His hand was so badly hurt that he would never be able to perform surgery again. But he was lucky to be released alive. Yet he still had to flee his own country, leaving behind his young family. Later, the mother of his child was killed in a government attack, and the baby was raised by her family, who did not want Juan in her life. Juan traveled north through Central America until he eventually found sanctuary in San Francisco and later in Washington, D.C. He volunteered in clinics, running support groups, and offering what resources he could. But this trained surgeon worked as a janitor. Honest work, it's true, but not the work he was trained for. He was unable to practice medicine in the United States. Eventually, he became an administrator at a clinic that treated immigrants. When pro bono lawyers helped Juan and other survivors to file suit against their former oppressors, Juan testified. His family really did not want him to, for his own safety, including his adult daughter with whom he'd reestablished contact. But he said the trial was necessary, and not just for his own sake, for everyone. Of his own testimony, he said that he needed to share the pain. If I share it, the guilt and the suffering are easier. I can tremble. I can cry. The weight that bears down on me can ease a little bit. After hearing Juan's harrowing testimony, a member of the jury had a question for the judge. The juror asked if it would be possible to see the victim's wounds. Any, quote, documentary medical, not psychological evidence showing the extent and severity of the injury suffered by the plaintiffs. Photos had already been entered into evidence, but the lawyers and their clients agreed to show the actual wounds in open court. Juan stepped forward to approach the jurors. He did not feel self-conscious. His surroundings melted away. He had the sensation of leaving his body and floating above himself. He was not alone. He was merging with the bodies of people he knew, those who had died, the mother of his child, Romero, his friends, his family members, Christians, people better than himself. A pressure lifted from his shoulders. A sense of community pervaded his body. The dead were alive and were with him. He said, so many scars in El Salvador, and we have the privilege to show ours. He said, everyone who is gone is here. 6 days later, the jury reached a verdict. The plaintiffs had won. It was not a criminal trial, and it was only a small measure of justice, but it was at least an acknowledgement that wrong had been done. And so for Dr. Juan Ramagosa, it was a chance for healing, at least for the start of healing. A few years after the trial, Juan went back to El Salvador, where he founded a free clinic in his hometown and was asked to run a regional public health department. It was the realization of a dream he'd had as a young doctor to help the people he'd grown up with. New life had emerged from death and destruction. It had taken a long time, but hope had won. Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Who can blame Thomas? Calling him the doubter is not fair. He only wanted to see with his own eyes what his fellow disciples had seen with theirs. They'd all experienced a terrible loss, a terrible trauma, but somehow being confronted with the evidence firsthand helped them to see the risen Christ in their midst more clearly, to recognize their beloved teacher, and to go about healing the world in his name. Joining with the disciples locked away in fear, with Juan Ramagosa and all the victims and survivors of government repression, human rights violations, and violent conflict, and with all people everywhere who have known difficult times, I pray that for all of us, our wounds and our times and places of pain will be transformed into joyful life. The world is full of scars. As Juan said, it is our privilege to show ours. When we come together in our woundedness and our vulnerability, everyone who is gone is here. In this sacred meal of the Eucharist that we're about to share, we are joined by the living and the dead and those yet to be. Bread and wine become the spiritual body and blood of one who gave his life for all. As we join together around this altar, we become a new community. The community of the wounded becomes the community of life and hope. Amen.